Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar hosted by the Burgess Salmon Environment team today. This is a reminder that all participants are in listen-only mode and the session is being recorded. I will now hand over to your host today, Mike Barlow. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Caroline, and good afternoon, everybody. As Caroline says, welcome to this webinar from the Burgess Salmon Environment team, which we're running jointly with Chemical Industries Association. The title of the talk is Beyond Reach, what the Environment Bill and the next wave of domestic environmental for UK industry. And what we've tried to do is pick out those areas of environmental law which will particularly apply to the chemical and manufacturing sectors. So just have a look at who's going to be talking to you today. Just waiting for the next slide. So 4 speakers today. There's myself, Michael Barlow, as Caroline said, and we've got Simon Tilling, Tom Gillette and Sarah Raby, all from the environment team. And turning to what we're going to cover, there's quite a lot to get through today, and the aim is to finish at 3 o'clock, as I'm sure you've all got very busy diaries. So we're going to have to go at a bit of a canter. As it says, there will be a Q&A at the end, and we'll try and leave time for that. You will all be on mute, so if you want to ask a question, and we very much do encourage you to ask questions, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom right hand of your screen, and if you type your question into that, then we will do our best to get to it at the end. If we don't get a chance to go to all of your questions, then we'll try and come back to you afterwards individually and answer your questions then. So I say we've got a full agenda, and we're going to look first of all at the UK's policy ambitions and the Environment Bill. That's the wider environmental agenda. And then Simon is going to look at how we untangle the UK legislation from EU chemicals law. And then we're going to move on to look at UK REACH, and Tom is going to deal with that in a little bit more detail. Sarah's going to pick up the carbon agenda, and then we're back to Simon, who's going to cover in relatively short time industrial emissions to air and water and the circular economy. So moving on then to the talk on environmental policy overview. And I wanted to put this slide up because whatever else happens, we do know that in the next 6 to 12 months, there are going to be significant changes to environmental law in the UK. And there's a whole series of reasons for that that are all pushing in that direction. And I've set those out in the 6 boxes on the left-hand side, and I'm sure there's other things that could be in those boxes as well. But those were the 6 main ones that occurred to me and I pulled out. The first 2, the domestic political agenda and Brexit, I'm going to look at in a bit more detail over the next couple of slides. But just turning in very brief detail to the bottom 4. There's the international agenda. We mustn't forget that the UK is party to a whole series of international treaties and so on. And you could pick out, for example, the Paris Agreement from 2015, which has implications particularly on the carbon agenda that Sarah is going to touch on later. Public opinion. I mean, I've been working in this field for 20 years, and certainly over the last year or 2, I've really seen an uptick in public opinion pressing for change in environmental legislation and policy. You only need to look at the plastics agenda following Blue Planet, Greta Thunberg, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. So all of those are also pushing towards significant change. Devolution, all of the environment is a devolved, is a reserved issue for the devolved administrations. So you can see that over the next five years or so, it's very likely that environmental law is going to be different in each of the devolved administrations, and that's going to lead to some complications. And then lastly, COVID-19. I think no talk at the moment is complete without touching on COVID-19. But I think that has a couple of implications here. Firstly, environmental issues tend to go up the agenda in times, in good economic times and down in bad economic times. Clearly, we're facing some bad economic times, so interesting to see what that does. But I think also it has shown during lockdown the difference that can be made when people do more walking and cycling and have cleaner air and water. So I think all that is going to push that way as well. So just in summary, we really are at a period of significant change. And I just now turn to the domestic political agenda. And I just wanted to pick up here a little bit of a chronology going back over the last decade, really over the various Conservative administrations that we've had since 2010, which have all led through to where we are with the current Environment Bill. And I think the broad point I would make here is that there was a considerable amount of rhetoric at the start of the decade, and maybe you could argue less delivery over that period. And I think what has really pushed things forward is the referendum vote in 2016 and the realisation that we are going to be in more control of our environmental laws and need to be going forward. So just picking out some points from that, at the bottom there's some quotes. You'll recognise the greenest government ever quote from David Cameron from 2011. And also the second quote, which was made in the 2011 white paper referred to on the slide, with a commitment to make ours the first generation to leave the natural environment in a better state than we found it. And you could say that not much has happened on that currently, but the last quote is from the explanatory memorandum to the current Environment Bill, with again our commitment to have the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth. So there's a lot of rhetoric there. But then just turning back to what has happened, you're probably all aware that there's a 25-year environment plan. And the need for that was first identified back in 2015 by the Natural Capital Committee. But little happened on it really until Michael Gove took over as a Secretary of State for the Environment following the 2017 election, which, as I say, is after the Brexit vote, and really pushed that forward so that we had an environment plan published in January 2018. And just on the right, you'll see the environment goals that are in that plan. And there's 10 of them. Again, you'd say that those are all very noble aims. And the general perception of the plan is that it was long on ambition, but short on delivery. But that's important to understand that agenda when we come to look at the Environment Bill. We'll just move on then quickly to look at Brexit. Again, this is a very significant piece in the development of the Environment Bill and environmental legislation going forward. And that's because around 80 to 90% of our law is derived from the EU. The EU has a really significant role in developing the plans and enforcing EU legislation against member states. And the need to untangle 40 years of law and governance. As I say, that's Simon will be looking at that in a bit more detail. But again, this is part of the lead up to the Environment Bill. I wanted to touch on section 16 of the EU Withdrawal Act from 2018, which there are some provisions in there which were put in as part of the discussions around how to deliver Brexit. And this is an amendment which recognised the potential lack of governance that would occur once the European Commission was no longer enforcing against government. And there was a requirement in the Act to put forward some environmental principles and governance process in a piece of legislation which came out in December 2018, and again that fed through into the current Environment Bill. And then lastly on Brexit, just to touch on this, it's obviously very uncertain at the moment with the negotiations where we're going to end up. Though we've heard that the government's not going to be seeking an extension, but that may well or not be the case going forward. And the environment plays a very important part of the level playing field negotiations, and so that is all very uncertain as to where that is going to end up. Clearly, the UK and the EU have very different views currently as to what they want out of those negotiations. So with all that background covered, I'm just going to touch very briefly on the Environment Bill and what that includes, because it's very wide-ranging and covers a number of points. The current position of the Environment Bill is that it's going through a parliamentary process. It's been suspended as a result of COVID, but it's still expected to be passed before the summer recess. And the current thinking is that it's not going to be very much amended from what it is now. It's got a couple of main themes to it. The first deals with principles and governance, and then the second has some specific provisions about changes to environmental law. On the governance and principles side, the first part is that the Act provides for the setting up of a new Office for Environmental Protection, which has a number of roles, both to provide advice to government, but also to take the role of the European Commission and investigate failures by public authorities to comply with environmental law. And it actually has the ability to take enforcement action as well in certain circumstances. And then the Act also provides for certain EU environmental principles, of which you're probably all and the principles are set out on the right. As I say, you'll recognise them: precautionary principle, principle of preventative action, and so on. So just move on then to the rest of the bill and what that covers. There is provision for targets and improvement plans. So the Secretary of State has to set out some long-term targets in certain areas. And it's also required to prepare an environment improvement plan, which has to be for longer than 15 years. And the 25-year environment plan, which I mentioned, is the first of those plans. And that needs to be reported on annually and reviewed every 5 years. And then the last part of the Act deals with specific provisions for changes to environmental law, which are set out on the slide. And I think the one passing point I would make at the end of this part of the presentation is that, as I said about the plan being long on ambition and short on detail, it's difficult to get from the Environment Bill as itself what all of those changes are going to be and what the targets are going to be, because the Secretary of State obviously has the power to put those forward, and so we'll wait to see how that develops. So I'm just going to pass over to Simon now to talk about how we untangle ourselves from the EU. Can I just remind you to put any questions that you have into the Q&A box so we can pick them up at the end. I can see a couple have come in, but it'd be great if you could add some more. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon UK time. Thank you and good morning to those of you joining from the US. And thank you particularly to the CIA for allowing us to join their webinar series and host this webinar. We've been associate members of the CIA now for several months. We've done a lot in chemicals over the years, and with everything that's going on, we thought it was right that we joined, and it's been a real pleasure to work with CIA staff and members to help shape what is a very important time, I think, for chemicals regulation, for environmental regulation in the UK, for all the reasons that Mike has outlined. Mike has set the future agenda, what we're looking to do, the UK policy and how things are going to be shaped going forward. I've got the rather more mundane role, I'm afraid, of really telling you how actually we stand still. We've had 40 years of environmental law, 40 years of EU chemicals regulations, and now we have to disentangle that so that we have a coherent body of UK law. For those of you doing homeschooling, you'll be probably bored to tears of lessons and lectures. For the next 10 minutes, this might sound a little bit like one. It sounds a little bit like Environmental Law 101, but I do think it's important that we set the foundations for understanding how this then rolls through to UK REACH, to industrial emissions, to the carbon agenda, EU ETS, and all these laws that have come from Europe. And Mike said 80 to 90% of our environmental law has come from Europe. For chemicals, of course, it's pretty much 100%. We have allowed the European Union, for good reasons, and we'll just touch on those in a moment, to set the laws for chemicals and the products made with chemicals and for specific chemistry, so that we have this common rule book to allow free trade in a single market, which of course is what the EU is all about. So on the slide there are a number of chemicals regulations regulating chemicals on their own or in products, specific chemistries or all chemistries like REACH that we're currently bound by. And we have the job in the UK of trying to make ourselves have a coherent, independent system that stands still, that keeps the status quo of what we've got. So how do we do that? First of all, we need to understand what the single market was all about. Why do we have these rules set by the EU? And I think it's worth remembering, with all the sort of heat and light of the debate, that we volunteered to join a supranational club. It's the EU is not its own jurisdiction. It's a lot of member states coming together in a club to have free trade, a single market. To have that, of course, we've had to have the four freedoms: goods, services, capital, and people. And to allow goods to move, chemicals to move, products made with chemicals to move around, we've had to have this common rule book. And that common rule book avoids these non-tariff barriers to trade, which are becoming so important when we talk about trade negotiations. So if a supranational club is going to set rules that bind everyone, what principles does it use to set the rules? And they have to be set down, and they are set down in the treaties that establish this club we were part of. So things like the precautionary principle, which of course is a big part of REACH and POPs and other chemicals, and indeed a big part of environmental regulation more generally, that's actually enshrined in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It's embedded into European law, which is why, as Mike was saying, when it came to looking at an environment bill for our own set of governance, we had to look at how in the UK we would do the same degree of embedding these principles into our law so that we had the same framework, even if in practice, as a sovereign independent UK, we get to do different things or do things in a different way. So that's why we've got this common rule book. And now we have to untangle these laws that have been entwined for 40 years. And I think we just need to remind ourselves that's different depending on what we're talking about. And this is the bit that gets very much like a law lecture. Bear with me, but I think it's important. Directives. That's where the European Union has said, this is what we must achieve. But there's a degree of flexibility for how member states achieve it to a certain extent. We'll issue the directive, you go away and you implement your rules and make them work in your member states. Fine, a good example, Industrial Emissions Directive. This is how the framework will work, but we have in England the environmental permitting, and Wales environmental permitting, and Scotland PPC moving across to permitting as part of the projects it's looking at up there. So we have law already in our jurisdictions that embed these rules. They are not without their own troubles when we come to disentangle, but they are easier than the next category, which are the regulations, like the REACH regulation. And these are set at European level, and they are rules that bind every market participant acting in the single market without much more from any of the member states. So the member states might have enforcement rules, so that they can actually take action in each member state. But the actual rules of the game are set by these regulations. And then, of course, you also have court decisions, judgments from the Court of Justice of the European Union, a whole body of case law that has taken sometimes opaque directives and regulations and clarified them, or sought to clarify them in court decisions, which then we apply or struggle to apply as we try and put those things into practice. So these are all sources of law that we've needed to do to deal with. So now we have to disentangle this. And where are we with that untangling? And I think it's really important. It's something that's we need to just keep coming back. It's amazing how often people get tripped up on where we are with the disentanglement. Of course, as everyone knows, Brexit is a historic event now. It's happened. We have left the European Union. We are independent now. And of course, that happened on exit day, which was 11 p.m. on the 31st of January 2020. So that's in the past. And the European Communities Act, on which all this law that we've been talking about bound actors in the UK, has been repealed. And that was done through the European Union Withdrawal Act, so that we actually have some law to deal with right now. So right now, we are still subject to EU REACH, of course, and the IED and other regimes. And the reason we are is because our Parliament has legislated for this transition period. So it's had a Withdrawal Act and a Withdrawal Agreement Act that says during this implementation period, which finishes at 11 p.m. At New Year's Eve this year, 31 December, we during that period, we have chosen as Parliament to stay in that club. Of course, the real question is what's going to happen therefore at 11 p.m. on 31 December 2020. And again, that's provided for. If we look at the next slide, we will look at the process of untangling, and there's a bit of law on this. Bear with me. The legal mechanism by which we do this is the Withdrawal Act and the Withdrawal Agreement Act working together. That provides for the transition period. That's fine. And then we have two really short provisions, actually, very short pieces of law. One says EU-derived domestic legislation, those directives we've already implemented into UK law, IED, now the environmental permitting. If it was effective as domestic law before exit day, it continues to be effective after exit day, and to a certain extent that works. Then the next one is section 3. It says direct EU legislation. So this is the regulations and the case law that bound us, but without any, you couldn't point to an act of parliament that it did in the UK. This says if it was operative immediately before completion day, so if we were bound by it, then it just automatically becomes, by act of parliament, it becomes our law on the 1st of January 2021. But of course, we all know that doesn't really work. That's a bit of a fallacy, because REACH, take REACH, full of references to member state committees, the European Chemicals Agency, the Board of Appeal, to the European Commission. We can't just read that law as if it does apply in the UK. And that's why we've had reams and reams and reams of these statutory instruments, and why we're getting more of them, that make the system actually work and substitute different words for different things. And I'm afraid for each of the regimes we operate in, we need to go and have a look at those to make sure we follow and track how these changes actually work in practice. And of course, government's put a lot of guidance out. Tom is going to talk us through in a little bit more detail where we may be with REACH at the moment. But that's how it works. And the question is, what are we going to do with that? There's the process of making it simply work, for which you can substitute for the European Chemicals Agency, read the Health and Safety Executive. Okay, you can do that, and that's what we're looking to do. So far, so good. But actually, we don't have the complete freedom we may say we do. We've left the European Union. We have not left the community of international law. We are bound by conventions to which the UK has signed up in its own right, like Stockholm, Rotterdam, Montreal, to name the chemicals ones. There's obviously also a whole bundle of UNECE rules around transboundary long-range pollution, all sorts of environmental rules. We've committed to what we'll do at international level. We're still bound by that. Mike mentioned Paris, a really good example. We've also chosen through Parliament, or Parliament imposed upon government, the need to re-embed these principles of EU law back into our UK law. So as Mike has said, clause 16 in the Environment Bill will give us principles which those making policy will have to have due regard to, which will mirror in some ways what they have in the treaties. Some lawyers might say actually it's weaker than in the treaties. The treaties simply stated them as principles of European law. These are simply principles that policymakers must have due regard to in setting policy. So there's a question about that. But the principles, if you dislike the precautionary principle or the polluter pays principle, I'm afraid it's here to stay and it's being hardwired into our law. Devolution is going to be a very important part of this equation, because safety and a free market in the single market of the UK are reserved to Westminster, but environment, which of course so much of this law, environmental law and chemicals law, drives towards, is devolved. So there's going to be testing of the boundaries of these devolution settlements. And one last point before I hand over to Tom is just an observation that this is a whole mechanism I've just talked through for how we untangle environmental law, covering the full range of European Union law. But interestingly, in the Environment Bill, REACH has been singled out. And normally, because REACH is a regulation, it has primacy. If you wanted to change how REACH operated once after exit day, once we have autonomy to do so, you would have to take that back through Parliament. But what the Environment Bill says is, actually, we Parliament are going to give the executive government the opportunity to change REACH through lesser law statutory instruments. And Rebecca Powell recently commented on this, saying we're going to keep the what of REACH, but we want the ability to change the how. And if you look at actually the powers given to the Secretary of State in this part of the Environment Bill, they're quite wide-ranging, and only REACH has been singled out for that. There's a real question why. Maybe that's one we can pick up as we continue this conversation. But on that point, I think I'd like to hand over to Tom to tell us a bit more about where we are with REACH.
There have been so many seismic changes to the political and legal landscape, as Simon and Mike have just set out. I think it's easy to forget that the current UK REACH template was effectively rushed through Parliament in early 2019 as part of the no deal preparations. The no deal solution that was created by Theresa May's government at the time can all be found in the blueprints of, well, the blueprint can be found in the REACH etc. amendment etc. EU exit regulations 2019 numbers 1, 2 and 3. And if nothing else, I think those titles, those names, give away some of the pressure that the legislative drafters were under at that stage. And I suspect if they'd had a little bit more time to think about it, they might have come up with a slightly snappier title. So what does the blueprint actually look like? The challenge for UK government back in January 2019 was to manage two potentially conflicting obligations. On one side, taking back control of our lawmaking, so taking the UK outside of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, while at the same time maintaining some semblance of the status quo for business. The solution that was found, as most of you will of course know, is a parallel UK REACH regime, which is based on the same concepts and structures, but obviously managed by UK regulators and in UK courts. Arguably, in the view of the UK government, in order to satisfy the concept of no data, no market, substance registration is required in both markets, so in the EU and in the UK. For the UK, this will mean building its own substance database to match that held by ECHA in Helsinki. And it will require those operating in the UK to submit information to build that database. Now, for those already operating in the UK, the data is not required from day zero following transition. As set out on this slide, registrations held by UK entities will be grandfathered into the UK system. Those companies having 120 days to submit basic information, and then a 2-year period with which to complete full registration with the dossier. There are also special arrangements for those entities whose status will change as a result of the new regime. So we call those the new importers. That's the downstream users whose status changes from being downstream user to being an importer as a result of now bringing substances from the EU into the UK. They have a little bit longer to submit the basic information, 180 days, but the full registration requirements still required within 2 years. This slide is designed to provide a summary of the bodies that will replace the EU institutions. We could do a whole hour on the differences between the various bodies, but given the time constraints, I'm going to limit my comments to a couple of key potential issues. As you'll see, the Health and Safety Executive will become the agency, will become ECHA effectively. I think the key concern that people have in this area is around the obvious potential for capacity and expertise issues. There have been moves to increase capabilities within the HSE, but the idea that you can replace the collective expertise of ECHA and each of the member state competent authorities is a really tall order. In terms of the ECHA Board of Appeal, rather than creating a Health and Safety Board of Appeal, the government has instead opted to use the existing UK tribunal system. As a department, i.e. the Burgess Salmon Environment Team, we have had cases before both bodies, and we can confirm that they're very different beasts. And that might be something that we can pick up later in the Q&A. I think just the key point to make there, though, is that the first tier tribunal is a court. It's an adversarial area. It's an adversarial arena by definition. BOA is not comparable to that. The process followed by the ECHA Board of Appeal is one of independent review, and also, of course, it allows for a second decision to be reached. That will not be something that we envisage being replicated in the first tier tribunal system. And I think those who are appealing decisions will need to take particular care to consider the audience that they're addressing when making those appeals. It's also worth noting that the creation of a second forum for appeal may create an opportunity for those with interest in substances to play one body off against each other. That will remain to be seen, of course, but while there's no direct read across between those two bodies, we envisage a scenario where whether it's ECHA or whether it's the first tier tribunal, decisions that are made are likely to be persuasive and referenced in the other forum. And finally, moving to the fact that the Secretary of State will now undertake the functions of the European Commission in relation to UK REACH. Obviously, the extent to which the Secretary of State chooses to tinker with the mechanisms remains to be seen, but as Simon said, the Environment Bill provides significant powers for the Secretary of State to make those changes. While there are 23 protected provisions which cover, as Simon said, the preserving the what, i.e. the principles will be preserved. The mechanisms and how you bring those about is very much in play for the executive should they wish to make substantive changes to the legislation. So what do we know about current intentions for change going forward? While everything remains subject to the outcome of the trade negotiations, I think it's fair to say that we don't anticipate significant change to the UK REACH SIs before, or indeed new SIs substantively changing the direction of travel before the end of the transition. The Rebecca Powell letter that Simon referred to makes it very clear that we're not pursuing associate membership, which of course was the concept raised under the Theresa May government era. And the messaging from government seems to be very much that the work has already been done, i.e. that the UK reach has already been placed on a statutory footing, and on that basis, the only assumption that seems to be drawn is that that blueprint will effectively be adopted with little further change. As the Boris Johnson quote demonstrates, I think it's fair to say that he has staked out his stall as being no great fan of reach, and of course that raises further questions about the extent to which his government would wish to retain the status quo. Of course, the government has also said that there won't be divergence for divergence sake or change for change's sake, but the big unknown, of course, is the impact that trade negotiations with third parties, in particular, I'm thinking about the US, will have on that direction of travel. Of course, before you even get to legislative divergence, i.e. before you have a situation where the Secretary of State might want to change reach, there is a significant scope for divergence by decision. By way of example, we have a live case acting for a substance task force. The Member State Committee is currently discussing an SVHC proposal in relation to the substance. And frankly, there's no consistency between, or there's no consensus between the viewpoints of the various different member states. Each is looking at the same data and coming to a different conclusion. Decisions of ECHA Board of Appeal, and ultimately of the HSE will turn on value judgments about what is the right science to follow. And it seems inconceivable that the EU and the UK would reach the same conclusions, even if they were, which they may not be, presented with exactly the same data. I thought it would be finally just worth mentioning that we are starting to see clients turn their minds to managing data and cost sharing for UK reach. Another sign that that industry is really gearing up to find its way through this new landscape. Interestingly, some people have been asking whether this is the time to move away from the classic CEFIC templates, the classic consortium agreements that I'm sure lots of you are familiar with under UK reach, and looking for a more global arrangement, one that works for managing the affairs within the EU reach scenario, but is also fit for purpose for other similar regimes. So we've always talked about those similar regimes being Korea and Turkey and others, but of course now we'll be talking about adding the UK into that mix. I can see that I've just hit my time limit, so I will now pass over to my colleague Sarah Raby, who is going to pick up on some of the other relevant issues to the wider manufacturing sector that flow out of the environment agenda, and in particular the carbon issues.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. The big ticket item on the carbon agenda is, of course, the question of how the UK is going to approach carbon pricing after the end of the Brexit transition period. And I'll come on to that shortly and for the main part of my segment. But there have also been some developments in our purely domestic emissions regimes, which are worth a quick canter through for completeness. In terms of the changes in UK domestic regimes, we've first got the Climate Change Act 2008, which gives legal effect to the government's commitment to achieve net zero on carbon emissions by 2050. When the Climate Change Act originally came in, there was an 80% reduction target by 2050 as against 1990 levels. We now have a 100% reduction target. This is getting a lot of coverage and is a really significant policy driver for the next few years. I think the tightening of emissions policy is likely to be an easier win for the government than many of the infrastructure-based aspects of change, which will need to be achieved in order to get to net zero. So this is likely to be an area of significant development in the next few years and will continue to be a key policy driver. As well as this overarching policy point, we've also had some recent changes to more specific granular aspects of domestic emissions policy, which are set out on the slide. First, the CCL carbon tax rates have been increased to recover the revenue that was lost from abolition of the CRC energy efficiency scheme last year. We've also seen rebalancing in the rates and are seeing continued rebalancing in the rates between gas and electricity to incentivise electric power as the cleaner energy source. On climate change agreements, the scheme had been due to finish at the end of this year, but has now been pushed out to 2025. And on the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Scheme, SECA, this is a new reporting obligation for companies and partnerships. The nature of the obligation varies depending on the type of entity, but in broad terms, it's to replace the reporting aspect of the abolished CRC. It's an additional requirement rather than replacing existing corporate reporting obligations, and it focuses on greenhouse gas emissions, energy consumption, and energy efficiency action. So that was a very rapid canter through what's been changing on a domestic level. Looking now at the real meat of this segment and the transition from EU ETS at the end of our Brexit transition period. Despite having now left the EU, as Simon emphasised in his session, under the UK-EU withdrawal agreement, the UK will remain in the EU ETS system until 11 p.m. on the 31st of December this year. That endpoint coincides with the end of phase 3 of the EU ETS scheme, so we would potentially be leaving, we will be leaving before phase 4 kicks in. Big question, what's going to happen at the end of the transition period? UK government's been looking at a range of options for carbon pricing going forward. One was continued participation in EU ETS, but that's off the table. The UK is scheduled to exit EU ETS at the end of the transition period, end of this year. The other two options on the table are either setting up a UK emissions trading system, either one which is linked to the EU ETS or which is standalone. Sorry, could we go back a slide for a sec? Sorry, thank you. That's option 1, UK ETS. Option 2 would be, instead of a trading system, a taxation scheme, carbon emissions tax. The government's been consulting on both of those options and published its response earlier this month. This confirms that the government will establish a UK ETS. It's been making practical as well as legal preparations for that. For example, procuring a supplier to build the IT registry for UK ETS. So real concrete steps being taken. Notwithstanding this, the carbon emissions tax is still being explored and provided for as a backup option. There are provisions in the Finance Act last year and being supplemented through the Finance Bill this year, which will provide for a £16 per tonne of carbon equivalent for emissions that exceed a set allowance threshold for any given period. The government's going to be consulting further on the structure of that tax later this year. So what do we know at the moment about what a UK ETS would look like? Thank you. What we know is that the plan would be to launch it in January next year, and the government and the devolved administrations have indicated that they'll be laying legislation in each of the 4 legislatures later this year so that that launch date can be achieved. What is also clear from the government's consultation is that the envisaged UK ETS would look really very similar to EU ETS. It would cover the same greenhouse gases, same sectors, and the same activities. The government has indicated that it would potentially look in due course to expand the scheme to cover additional sectors, potentially looking at agriculture and land sectors, but that will not be from the outset. As with the EU ETS, most allowances will be auctioned, but there will be a proportion of allowances that are allocated for free, and the initial approach to that will mirror EU ETS and what the UK would have had under phase 4. In terms of differences, the key one is that the allowances cap for UK ETS will initially be set 5% below what the UK's notional share of the EU ETS cap for phase 4 would have been. Also on differences, there are some simplifications proposed to the current EU monitoring, verification and reporting requirements. I suppose touching in a bit more detail on this more stringent cap on allowances, that really draws out what will be for the government one of the key benefits of having a UK ETS system as opposed to continued participation in EU ETS, is that control over the detail of our emissions trading system will sit in the UK rather than in Brussels, and that will mean that it can be used as a policy lever to drive things, well, chiefly our net zero agenda. BEISA says that it wants to use the UK ETS to help drive emissions reductions even further, faster. I mentioned that the cap for the UK ETS will initially be set 5% below what our share in the EU scheme would have been. There was discussion of whether this would be brought down further in order to drive the net zero agenda faster, and the Committee on Climate Change advised the government to do this. And while the government considered this carefully, what it has now said is that given in particular the context of the uncertainties and risks posed by COVID-19, it's going to stick with the 5% reduction for now. But once the new system is up and running, it intends to follow the CCC's advice and further amend the cap again in line with its net zero target. So while we now know a fair amount about what a UK ETS would look like, there are still some big gaps in the picture, and to the extent that we haven't got where we need to on this by January, then there is the provision for the CET to be in there as a backstop measure to cover any period until it's all settled. The two big questions, I think, are firstly whether or not UK ETS is going to be linked to EU ETS, and the answer to this is going to hinge on the ongoing Brexit trade negotiations. The UK said as long as it would serve the interests of both sides, then it's open to linkage, and a large proportion of respondents to the government's consultation thought that there should be linkage because there's a concern that a standalone UK ETS would suffer from market volatility as a result of being such a smaller market. Another big question is what the transition from EU ETS will look like, how it will be dealt with, what happens to any unused allowances that are held by UK participants at the end of the membership. When No Deal Brexit was looking like a very real prospect, we were advising a number of clients on steps to take to ensure that the value in unused allowances wasn't lost, and this might again be something that is a really important question for the coming months when we know more about how things will look in January. So that was a swift canter through carbon, and I'll now hand on to Simon to touch on a few other areas of non-chemical specific but chemicals relevant regulation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm conscious of time. I will try to get through some of these points relatively quickly. Of course, they are all very much relevant to chemicals manufacturing in the UK and indeed other manufacturing in the UK. Industrial emissions. Industrial emissions it is clearly one of the big drivers for how we regulate on sites, and the 2 points really, two important points in terms of where we are with this. We actually in the UK developed the system of integrated pollution control, which was adopted in the IPPC directive and into the Industrial Emissions Directive. So the idea of integrated pollution control regulated through permits, that's very much here to stay. That's confirmed among other places in things like the Clean Air Strategy. We've also got, of course, as Mike said at the start, the Environment Bill, which provides now for the Secretary of State to set targets on air quality, water quality, and these targets for the natural environment, which are then translated into what you can do under your permit. So we envisage a ratcheting up, excuse me, of these targets as the 25-year environment plan is delivered through the Environment Bill. That trickles down into permits. Now, as many of you on the call will realise, of course, a lot of the issues are diffuse pollution, and of course, industry and emissions from industry has been coming down and down and down through the permitting regime. But if you look at the Clean Air Strategy and that quote in pink, you'll see that clearly government finds it quite easy to regulate point source emissions, and it does say here that we can make further reductions, and so we do think that will have a direct improvement. So they're going to use these mechanisms to further drive things like air quality, and the air quality debate, water quality, as Mike said, very much on the political agenda, very much in the news. Only in the last this week, the Clean Air Strategy has been challenged by lawyers because of the link between air quality, poor air quality, and COVID-19. We've also got the mechanisms within the IED to set what the permit conditions will be. And of course, we've got the Sevilla process, where the UK has been a member, takes part in that, and you set best available techniques. You discuss those and you set your back conclusions at a EU-wide level for a level playing field. As part of the trade negotiations and discussions of level playing fields, that's an interesting point. Assuming, which is the current position, the UK will set its own back conclusions. What is the status of the one set by the EU, taking account of 27 other developed economies of an equivalent to the UK? If they're completely different, will people be using that as an opportunity to challenge? If ours are not seen to be as stringent, will NGOs use the EU back ones, back decisions, conclusions to challenge the UK decisions? One point on derogations, we've had a number of occasions where the Environment Agency officers have said, oh, well, we think you're ripe for a derogation, but that has to go to Brussels and we politically don't want to do that. So let's come up with another solution. We'll amend your permit, but we'll give you an enforcement notice saying we won't enforce for this breach of permit for 3 years because you need time to adapt it. So you'd find these workarounds to derogations because we didn't want to engage with Brussels, or potentially, allegedly, maybe that was the case. So a lot more flexibility potentially in delivering some of these outcomes. And also the devolution agenda, just as relevant to IED as to the others. Environment is a devolved matter, but we want a single standard, surely, for BAT for the single UK market, at least. So the competent authorities of our devolved administrations working together is going to be important. And very quickly, looking at time, I'm conscious we've got quite a lot of questions coming through, so do keep them coming through. If we don't get to all of them in this session, we'll see what we can do to follow up with you. So do keep sending them through. We'll get to those in a moment. Just a few notes before I finish on waste and plastics. The circular economy, that's not gone away. Look at the Blue Planet 2 effect on waste and plastics in particular. Vilified at the moment. We can argue about that, but there is going to be a focus on that. Those of you in monomers and polymers and plastics generally, or plastics and products, that's going to have an issue. There was a question about the SCIP database that's already come in, I've noticed, on the Q&A, which I can conveniently deal with here. For those not familiar with it, it's the Substances of Concern in Products database. It's a Waste Framework Directive mechanism, but it says so that we know what's in the products when we get to its end of life, can ECHA maintain a database of all products that have SVHCs, substances of very high concern. Because that's a Waste Framework Directive obligation on the European Chemicals Agency, that's not something that we've needed to bring into our domestic law, nor have we nor is it already part of our domestic law. So it's part of this untangling. It's quite a confusing part of it, but the upshot is it's not being brought across as a mandatory point, but the latest from April, I think, of this year is that DEFRA is giving careful consideration to an equivalent. So the UK may well be bringing forward a version of the SCIP database in the UK. Lots to talk about that too, but I'm conscious it's 5 minutes to 3, so I'll hand back to Mike and see if we can get to some of these questions.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, Simon said we have got a number of questions. I did promise that we would finish by 3, so we'll see how we get on. First one, I'll probably go to you in the first instance, Simon, and then I might chip in, or Sarah might chip in, which is with regard to the ECHA Board of Appeal and differences with the UK First Tier Tribunal. Do we know where the scientific expertise for the tribunal will come from? The ECHA Board of Appeal has clear scientific and legal representatives. Will there be transparency?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. The tribunal system is set up, unlike the court system. In the court system, it's Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal System. So it's all one department, it's all governed. But the benefit of the tribunal system is that you can have experts sitting next to judges on the bench of the tribunal. So I believe the intention will be, like the Board of Appeal, to have an expert in chemicals regulation and expert in chemicals, the science of whatever the issue may be that's in dispute, substance evaluation or whatever it is that's before the tribunal, and there will be a judge and a technically qualified expert. Where's that expertise going to come from? Very good question. The First Tier Tribunal needs to recruit. I believe last time I had the discussion with someone in the know on that they were actively looking for experts that they would recruit to that panel to serve that function. But the Board of Appeal is set up precisely for it. It's the ECHA Board of Appeal. It deals with appeals from ECHA decisions. There's a legally trained member and there's a technically trained member, but they are used to it. What I think with the tribunal system is going to be interesting is we're going to have a judge who will be doing all sorts of other regulatory issues. And yes, a technical person brought on at the same time, but it's very much a legal forum. And I'm quite interested to see how much legal principles and English law really comes to the fore when we're trying to deal with these in a way that the Board of Appeal just simply doesn't do. And it's a very adversarial chamber, the tribunal system. Yeah, I think we're going to see some, on paper they might look quite similar. I think we're going to see some quite different approaches in how they hear cases and how they react to challenging decisions of the HSE. And we just have to see how that plays out. But I think there could be some interesting things to observe, and they are really quite different. So I think you wouldn't necessarily expect them to come to the same decisions on the same cases, even if the same evidence is presented in the same way.
I think I agree with that, Simon. And obviously, I've got a case going through First Tier Tribunal, the lab at the moment, and they very much sit with an expert surveyor and a judge. And are very used to dealing with the issues that come before them. And I think there will be over time that will develop. I think in the interim it's going to be interesting to see how it does develop. But I think the key point, as you say, is the difference between the adversarial nature and the ECHA Board of Appeal. I've got one more that I think I'm going to try and squeeze in, which is probably unfair on Tom, but it's Tom, over to you. Says that you mentioned data sharing agreements drawn up by CEFIC, and they could be replaced by a more globally flexible one. Is that to your knowledge, or is that a crystal ball prediction? If you could do that one quickly.
Well, we certainly don't have any knowledge of replacements to the CEFIC database, unless Simon wants to jump in on that. I don't. My point was really that we're starting to see clients who are thinking about how they're going to manage their arrangements on a global scale going forward, and are thinking about how they might go about drafting those agreements to manage across various different jurisdictions. Obviously, the EU consortium for the vast majority will hold a lot of that data. So it's, rather than keep bolting things into the CEFIC agreement, the question is it better to take a step back and to think about it on a global scale?
I think we might have just lost Mike temporarily at the crucial moment. I can see a little exclamation mark where Mike might be. It's 3 o'clock exactly. So thank you all very much for your attendance today. We did say we wouldn't go past 3, so we'll hold ourselves to that. It's been really good. There's a lot of questions we didn't get to. We'll try and follow up independently after the event on that. But thank you so much for attending and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. To confirm, the webinar has concluded and recording will now end. Thank you very much.